It's an exciting day to gather together to help keep Oakland covered with a focus on roof repair, protecting, preserving, and progressing the stability of making sure that our families and loved ones remain sheltered with a safe roof over their head, and the values that we share to make sure that we prioritize the needs of so many. And thank you all again for joining us. Lisa has just been a phenomenal executive director to work with, and we have an amazing guest speaker with Mr. Rustin as we work to build a better future for Oakland together. Lisa shared it, the catastrophic events of 2020 have just exacerbated America's ongoing problems with institutionalized racism. And we know that today, too many families in Oakland, they're unsheltered, they're struggling to stay housed, and we're working to prevent them from being displaced as housing prices and rents soar, with more than 70% of those unhoused and without shelter being Black. Oakland, we're faced with this weight of just the rapidly increasing demands of displacement and disproportionate cost burdens and life impacts and growing disparities with many low-income families, our seniors, our veterans, and disabled neighbors that are facing today. Rebuilding Together Oakland East Bay, they have been a champion fighting for everyone to have safe, healthy homes and a solid roof over their head. Their incredible commitment, and those that we'll hear from today, has been to help sustain our neighbors for almost 30 years, repairing homes, revitalizing communities, and rebuilding lives through it all. So I'm excited to hear more today as we gather to uplift, to strengthen, to rebuild lives together, transforming lives in love and power and more resources, more funding, our overwhelming compassion and action. I remember the first time I came in relationship with Rebuilding Together. They had an office next to my old office in West Oakland on Wood Street. It was a warehouse at Wood Street and 11th. And I used to always wonder, what are people doing going in there? And I got so curious that I got invited in. And from that moment, I have not left being attached to this amazing organization. We just do a lot in partnership to even ensure that there's charitable giving that supports this work. I've witnessed personally lives being transformed, seniors in our lives, seniors in my neighborhood, and those that I know from West Oakland to East Oakland. I was out there a couple weekends ago, and to see seniors and families that we've supported still preserved, protecting our residents from losing home and losing that quality of life, and that's just amazing. So I'm just honored to be joined in this role of support today. It's an even more critical time of supporting Rebuilding Together and leveraging our networks to come alongside during this critical crossroad of life and housing. So I look forward to hearing from our guest speaker, one of my favorite books we're going to talk about. I've got my notepad out. I look forward to hearing from those who we've partnered with, those who have benefited from that work in real, practical, and tangible ways to help families stay whole, to heal, to rest, to rejoice, to relax, to age with dignity. So thank you, RTO, for having me. Thank you for the impact that you've already made this year, assisting over 130 seniors. We're going to continue to find creative ways to keep a roof over our community members' heads, to keep them safe, and to serve together during these difficult times. So let's move forward. Let's jump into our wonderful program, and let's learn more about RTO now. Let's watch this video.
My name is Lucy Genova. I'm the program manager.
My name is Sonia Barragan, and I'm the program coordinator at Rebuilding Together Oakland East Bay. I process all the applications and answer any phone calls from the homeowners. I also take care of the Safe at Home modifications program.
Safe at Home programs are small modifications to the bathroom, which is to provide low-income elderly people, people with disabilities, and veterans repairs. Make sure they have non-skid bath mats. We also provide a fire safety. We give them a fire extinguisher. We install carbon monoxide detectors, smoke detectors, night lights if they need, just to make them safe and healthy in their homes. So Rebuilding Together Oakland East Bay does the volunteer work during a national rebuilding days, which is in the month of April. And then we also do our fall rebuilding days.
I think it's satisfying to be able to work with the homeowners on a day-to-day basis, because we just, sometimes by just a simple phone conversation, they feel, so much better. Or we're also on the front lines of like being able to actually help them and repair their home, which is something that, makes them tremendously happy.
Every single project is different and the volunteers are different, the dynamic is different. But at the end, everybody's happy and it's the most rewarding thing ever. And I think that's probably why I work at Rebuilding Together Oakland. I love it. And I wish there was more funding. I wish we could help way more people because it's really needed, especially in Oakland. I just want to say without you, we would not be able to do what we do. And we just want to say thank you from the bottom of our hearts. We appreciate you. Thank you.
Wow, what a powerful message. And I have to say that we are so fortunate to be working with Lucy and Sonia. We have some incredible people with us on our board, a couple of whom you're going to hear from shortly. We are and we have been a housing equity organization since the inception of what was called Christmas in April way back in 1984 in Midland, Texas. So this work isn't new to us. Our work advances housing equity. One of the things that we don't always think about is that we are preserving assets for the next generation and maintaining the fabric of neighborhoods and communities right here where we live. It's really up to us to help them. The most effective way to tell this story is for our homeowners, our clients, our neighbors to tell you their experiences. And so we're going to move to a short video where you're going to hear from them directly.
I've lived here 44 years. Didn't have no money for the roof, so I said, here I am. I'm stuck. I'm really stuck. Somehow, here come RTO. I was just swept away because I didn't know what I was gonna do. And I said, now this can't be free. It was all free. My neighbor on the left, he just come and he was amazed. He started fixing his house up. Then the guy across the street, the lady next door. I've been an inspiration to the neighborhood.
Wow, it looks beautiful. What you guys have done and the way everything looks has really put an imprint forever on my life. And all I can say from the bottom of my heart is thank you. I love you. It's amazing. Thank you.
Rebuilding Together Oakland is an amazing organization that, to me, has changed my uncle's life for the rest of his life. To show that people care for you at a certain, especially at a certain age, it's like, oh my God, it just opens up everything now, for him.
Over the years, it just started going down. And then I used to ask him all the time about getting the loan for the house. And he would always say, nope.
Because the house was all paid off.
And I think he felt a sense of relief, at last, he paid his dues. He deserved better.
It feels good, you really feel uplifted, to show you that somebody cares,
Where would we be without RTO? It's changed our life completely.
Never, never forget you guys. Just like angels coming from above.
They're the best thing that ever happened to us.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this event. My name is Mark Epstein. I am a litigation partner with the Oakland law firm of Wendell Rosen and a member of the board of Rebuilding Together Oakland East Bay. For those of us involved with the organization, it is a passion. We get the opportunity to give back directly to the community. In the years past, had teams that are doing hands-on projects at various homes throughout the community, which of course has been waylaid by the COVID pandemic. So during this time when we're having to practice social distancing and not being able to put teams together to work on projects, we have started this Keeping Oakland Covered program to put into effect immediate roof repairs before the rainy season comes. Right now, we are focused on continuing to raise funds for our Keep Oakland Covered program, as well as the Safe at Home program that you heard a little bit about. We really want to thank you for your contributions, because without you, we're not going to be able to keep these programs going. These programs are of the utmost importance during this time. With due luck and a little help from above, we're going to be able to return in the spring of 2021 to doing our hands-on projects with our team members. So again, thank you for joining us here today, and we most gracious for your contributions. Thank you.
I'm super excited to introduce our new fundraiser called Keep Oakland Covered for our roof repair program. We have over 40 low-income homeowners, low-income seniors that they need a roof repair. Unfortunately, one roof can cost between $5,000 and $20,000 depending on how bad the roof is. We were able to provide one roof repair for a veteran, and seeing the pictures before and after, you do not have to be physically there to experience the happiness, to experience the work and the important message we're building together. Oakland East Bay does, because it's astonishing, like what funding can do, how we can help a person to safely live in their home. My hope is that this fundraiser will raise funds to do 10 roofs. That would be amazing. 11 would be even better. For 40, whew, that would be amazing. Everything you donate will go straight to help us repair all the roofs that we have and keep Oakland covered. Thank you.
What a kickoff to our Keep Oakland Covered Roof campaign. My name is Richard Tong. I am a market president for Heritage Bank of Commerce, and I'm also the immediate past president of Rebuilding Together Oakland East Bay. And I know that I have spoken to many of you at our in-person Gather Together events. So this is something that I do appreciate you all joining us. I mean, you know, and you've seen the power of the work that we do. And 40 homes with leaky roofs, that's a big number. Our campaign goal today is 46,000. We're a little over halfway there. So your participation and your support is much appreciated. We're all doing the best that we can, and I just want to thank you guys for taking the time out today to join us. At Rebuilding Together Oakland East Bay, we think of three things. It's the in-kind services and the donations and the sponsorships, as well as the volunteers. And we have a great many of them, but each year we like to highlight one special group that has helped us along for many years. And this year's Champion Award goes to our friends at Renewal by Anderson. They've been engaged with us, and we've worked together to develop a resilient and thriving partnership that integrates our work into the fiber of our organizations. Service installations and donations of windows, financial support of their employees and to the neighbors served by Rebuilding Together Oakland East Bay. And the teams that come out and help us to rebuild and revitalize in our communities. And so that's what we have to say about the wonders of Renewal by Anderson. And I'd like to say congratulations to Renewal by Anderson, and representing them is Brent Anderson. So let's hear what they have to say. Brent.
My name is Brent Anderson. I'm the Director of Operations with Renewal by Anderson of San Francisco. This is a very meaningful experience for me. Working with Rebuilding Together has expanded our abilities to help in the community, and it's really feels special to be able to contribute in so many different ways.
What was meaningful to me was meeting with the homeowner and seeing how thrilled and grateful they were at the end of the project.
For me, it was the opportunity to work directly with my team and the Rebuilding Together team.
I was born and raised in this area, and seeing like how one little thing can change someone's life forever.
It was exciting, it was rewarding. You feel proud to work for this company that is so giving.
I feel like it was bonding because we were working together, not just working, but on something else, helping someone. That's one of the reasons why I love working here.
I think it's pretty much a no-brainer if you can make a change, especially if it's just involving a little labor or a little effort on your part, and make a change for someone who can't do anything. That's what we should be doing.
In integrating new employees into our company, we spend a segment of time talking about our relationship with Rebuilding Together, our commitment, our core values, the things we've done, and what we intend to continue doing.
I'm proud to be a rebuilder. I really take pride in these events as team building and working with the local Rebuilding Together office and just the community. And I really want to thank all of you for allowing us the opportunity to help in so many different ways.
I am proud to be a rebuilder.
I am proud to be a rebuilder.
I'm proud to be a rebuilder.
Thank you, Rebuilding Together.
Thank you, Rebuilding Together, Oakland East Bay.
Thank you, Renewal by Anderson.
Thank you, Renewal by Anderson.
Well, thank you. And Brent, I'm glad you're here virtually with us to accept our award.
This is an honor and a privilege for all of us at Renewal by Anderson. We love working with Rebuilding Together, the Oakland East Bay team, as we live our company core value of giving back. Our partnership and working to help our community with fundraisers, cash donations, and group projects allows all of our team to participate in ways that best suit them, the community, along with the Oakland East Bay team. This is the most important work that we do. Thank you. We look forward to many years of rebuilding together.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Brent. It is really a joy to work with all of you. So now we are going to move to our main event here. Allow me to introduce Richard Rustin. He is the author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. He has been interviewed by Ta-Nehisi Coates, by the New York Times, by PBS, by Fresh Air. He was longlisted for the National Book Award. He wrote this book. It was published in 2017. So pretty much, I mean, we were in the throes of all the housing issues, but certainly he really recognized and knew that we needed to delve deeper into this issue. I want to just quote Sherilyn Ifill, who's the president of NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. What she said about Richard's book is that you reveal a history of racism hiding in plain sight that compels us to confront the consequences of the intentional, decades-long governmental policies that created a segregated America, and that the American landscape will never look the same to readers of this important book. So all of you here, I know that you care about housing policy, regional and local. So read this book if you haven't already. And Richard, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Lisa.
It's just such a joy. So I was thinking that how we would start is for you to, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what spurred you on to write this book.
Well, sure. I was an education policy writer. I didn't know anything about housing. In fact, all I knew about housing was what I learned from my daughter. But I was an education policy writer, and briefly I came to the conclusion that the biggest problem facing schools was segregation. Schools are more segregated today than they ever have been in the last 45 years. And the reason they're more segregated is that the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. And so I began to think of neighborhood segregation as an educational problem. And I began to look into it a bit, and the deeper I got into it, the less I was thinking about education, and the more I was thinking about how enormous our problems in housing are, and particularly those that create a pattern of segregation in every metropolitan area of this country.
One of the things in reading your book that I personally was most astonished by, or not only learning about the government choices, around stabilized housing, around the history of that housing, which is something I think actually that to talk about, but also some of the people I was thinking about, I think it was George Romney, people that tried to stop or tried to thwart the governmental policy because they knew that, that what was happening was really wrong.
Well, yes. Do you want? Shall I comment on that?
Please do.
Sure. You know, George Romney, a very interesting character, the father of the present senator from Utah. You know, we've had a lot of talk lately, and probably many of you know about the Trump administration's repeal of the furthering fair housing, affirmatively furthering fair housing rule that the Obama administration implemented. George Romney had a much more aggressive rule than what the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule was in the Obama administration. That was in 1970. He was the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development in the Nixon administration. He understood what we've all forgotten. And you know, Lisa, the subtitle of my book is A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. It was well known as recently as when George Romney was Secretary of HUD. He knew that the reason we had a white noose, he called it that, around every metropolitan area of the country was because the government had created it on an explicitly racial basis. And he adopted a program called Open Communities, which was very similar to the affirmatively furthering fair housing plan, but much more aggressive. He proposed to withhold funds, federal funds under the Community Development Block Grant Program from any suburb that refused to desegregate, that refused to take explicit action to desegregate, including accepting of public housing, not just affordable housing, and changing its zoning rules. And he actually withheld federal funds from 3 suburbs under this Open Communities program, went much farther than the Obama administration ever got to go. And the 3 suburbs, one was outside Cleveland, one was Baltimore County, and another was Warren, Michigan. And there was a backlash, a white backlash against this program. And Nixon, who was feeding the backlash, reined George Romney in, forced him out as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, canceled the Open Communities program. And we haven't seen anything so aggressive since, including the affirmatively furthering fair housing program. The lesson I learned from that is that in order to do anything about residential segregation in this country, we need a mobilized civil rights movement that's going to support those kinds of programs. And that the biggest obstacle we face to desegregating this country is not people who consider themselves conservatives, but people we call NIMBYs, people who think of themselves as progressive and liberal, except when it's in their own community. And so we need a civil rights movement that's going to extend into those communities as well in order to make it possible to implement the kind of program that George Romney attempted to do.
And do you see any people, I guess we're getting a little bit beyond the scope of your book, but do you see any policies or people right now that are, trying to, echo those movements and try to be very active in making changes today?
Well, there are many people doing small work around this issue in different places. I recommend, I'm sure many of you already have, that you read a book by Connor Dougherty called Golden Gates about segregation in the Bay Area. And he describes some groups that are trying to abolish single-family zoning that helps to perpetuate residential segregation here in the Bay Area. There are groups all over the country that are working on affordable housing issues. That's part of the picture. It's not the whole thing, because we misuse the term affordable housing. By affordable housing, we typically mean housing for low-income families. That's the only group for which federal subsidies are available through the low-income housing tax credit program. But the middle-class and working-class families disproportionately African American, also can't afford housing in today's housing markets and are being forced to move much, much farther away from their jobs in order to find housing. Teachers, nurses, construction workers. There's a terrible stereotype that exists in the policy community that African American and poor are synonyms. Most African Americans are not poor. Most African Americans are what we call working class, lower middle class, the kinds of occupations I just named, and they can't afford housing either in many communities, particularly in the Bay Area, but around the country. And we have no subsidies available for families like that. And so they earn too much to be eligible for low-income housing tax credit units, and they earn too little to be able to afford market rate units, especially in places like Oakland and San Francisco and elsewhere in the Bay Area. So they're forced to move farther and farther away. So we do have a lot of people working on affordable housing. We have some programs in some communities of people who are helping Section 8 voucher holders move to higher opportunity communities. We have some places that are doing a better job than others in placing some low-income housing tax credit developments in higher opportunity communities. Some places that have inclusionary zoning requirements, again, typically only for low-income families, not for what we call the missing middle that's increasingly at risk of not being able to find adequate housing. So there are many efforts around the country. They're all small, and they're not supported by a national, locally based civil rights movement at this point, but I'm hopeful that one can grow.
I think for people that haven't had an opportunity yet to read your book, if you would be able to summarize, and it doesn't have to be a very short summary, it could be a lengthy summary, the key points of your book and how the government did segregate housing.
Well, I can talk for 3 years about this. I'll resist the temptation and try to do it short. The simple summary of the book is that we have a national myth. The myth is that the reason we're segregated, and we're segregated in every metropolitan area of the country. I've lived in many of them. Every one that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that are either all white or mostly white, clearly defined areas that are all black or mostly black. And we have a national myth that says the reason that that's the case, and we have a term that we use for it, we call it de facto segregation. De facto segregation, it's a term that's used by all of us, blacks and whites, liberals, conservatives, northerners, southerners, easterners, westerners, any way you cut it, everybody uses the term. And by de facto segregation, we mean something that was not created by government. As we understand that when government required the segregation of schools or colleges or lunch counters or buses or any of the things that we addressed in the 20th century, that's unconstitutional. The federal government was doing it. It was a violation of the Fifth Amendment, and we understood and understand that that's a civil rights violation that we all have an obligation to remedy. If the state and local governments were doing it, that's a violation of the 14th Amendment and equally a civil rights violation that we have to remedy. But we tell ourselves that racial segregation of neighborhoods, that's something entirely different. That's not, the government had nothing to do with that. That just happened naturally. It happened because, bigoted landlords or homeowners refused to sell or rent to African Americans in white neighborhoods, or because actors in the private economy, banks, real estate agents, not government agencies, but private businesses, discriminated. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's just because blacks and whites like to live with each other, the same race. We like it better that way. We feel more comfortable with people who have the same skin color as we do. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's all because of income differences. African Americans, on average, have lower incomes than whites, and so many of them can't afford to move to middle-class white neighborhoods. And we tell ourselves that all of these individual, bigoted, but personal, private sector, economic differences, factors is what created residential segregation. And we comfortably tell ourselves that if it happened by accident, it can only unhappen by accident. The reason I wrote this book is to show that that's an utter myth. There's no basis in reality to it whatsoever. There are many, many very racially explicit federal, state, and local policies in the 20th century that were designed to ensure and succeeded in ensuring that blacks and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area. As a result, the racial segregation, the racial boundaries we have in cities all over this country are a constitutional violation. They're as unconstitutional as the segregation of lunch counters. As such, we have an obligation as American citizens to do something about it, to fix it, just as we did to abolish the segregation of lunch counters and water fountains and buses in the 20th century. I can, if you want, describe the policies that the federal government followed, for example, to ensure that the neighborhoods would be segregated, that blacks and whites couldn't live near one another. That's what I do in the book.
I think that would be very helpful for people to know. And one of the things, again, that I found most informative, something I did not know, is that what we now call affordable or subsidized housing wasn't meant to be subsidized at all.
I think what you're talking about is the origins of public housing, which we all misunderstand. We think it's for poor people, and that's what it is, what it became. But that's not how public housing began in this country. The first public housing for civilians in this country was constructed during the New Deal and the Depression. It was for working class, middle class families who could afford the full cost of the housing in their rent, and they paid full rent for it. There were no subsidies involved. It was built because in the Depression, there was a housing shortage. No construction, no private construction to speak of was going on. And so working class, middle class families couldn't find housing. And so the Public Works Administration, the first New Deal agency, built the first public housing in this country. And everywhere it built it, it segregated it, creating separate projects for whites, separate projects for African Americans. And I'll say this that I think may surprise some of you, but in many cases, it segregated neighborhoods that had previously been integrated. We would be stunned if we were somehow transported back to the 20th century to the extent of residential integration that existed. It existed because we were a manufacturing economy. None of this internet stuff going on. We were making things, and factories needed to be located near deep water ports or railroad terminals to get their parts and ship their final products. So if you had a factory district that was employing both black and white workers, they would have to live in broadly the same neighborhood so they could walk to work, maybe take short streetcar rides. But nobody was living in the suburbs at that time, except for the affluent. So the Public Works Administration went into these urban neighborhoods and built the first civilian public housing in this country on a segregated basis. May surprise some of you to know the very first public housing project that was built in this country was in Atlanta, Georgia, which had segregated lunch counters and segregated buses and segregated schools, but integrated neighborhoods for the reasons I just described. The Public Works Administration went into an area outside Atlanta called the Flats, just outside downtown Atlanta, integrated neighborhood, about half white, half black, demolished housing and built a project for whites only, forcing the African Americans who lived in that area to leave, double, triple up with relatives, find less adequate housing elsewhere. In my book, The Color of Law, I describe the great African-American poet, novelist, playwright that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. He describes in his autobiography how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. He said his best friend in high school was Polish. He said he dated a Jewish girl in high school. Not surprising in an integrated high school, an integrated neighborhood, but that central area of Cleveland integrated. The Public Works Administration demolished housing there and built two separate projects, one for white, one for African Americans, creating a pattern of segregation in Cleveland that hadn't previously existed. In my book, The Color of Law, the Bay Area isn't the only smug, self-satisfied place that I talk about. I do talk about the Bay Area, but here's one for you. Maybe some of you have heard of Cambridge, Massachusetts, the area between Harvard and MIT, called the Central Square neighborhood. It was a fully integrated neighborhood in the 1930s, but the Public Works Administration demolished housing and built two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating segregation there where it hadn't previously existed. Let me make one other point about this. There were very few African Americans living here in the Bay Area or on the West Coast prior to World War II. the great migration of African Americans out of the former slaveholding states into the rest of the country took place around World War I and brought Black workers and their families to Cleveland and Detroit and Chicago and Pittsburgh, places like that, not to the West Coast. The great migration of African Americans to the West Coast took place during World War II. And to take jobs in war industries, like shipyards in particular. And there was no housing for them. Black and white workers were migrating. I'm not talking about African Americans alone, migrating here to take those jobs. If the government wanted the ships to be built and the other war material that was also being built on the West Coast, it had to find housing for these workers, and it did. It created segregated housing for Black and white war workers who were working together in the same shipyards and the same plants. In San Francisco, the government created 5 public housing projects for war workers only. 4 were for whites only. 1 was for African Americans. They placed it in the Fillmore district, and that became the Black neighborhood of San Francisco. Here in the East Bay, the Richmond shipyards were a major source of employment during World War II, the Kaiser shipyards in particular. And the government built segregated housing along the bay, along the railroad tracks that ran, that brought workers from Oakland up to the shipyards and in between. It built one project that I think is interesting on the along the bay in the area spanning Berkeley and Albany. It's called Colderness's Village, and it built housing in that project. Along San Pablo Avenue, near retail shopping and other residential areas for white war workers only, and buildings for Black workers only were placed in the industrial area along the railroad tracks. After the war, Congress required the government to get rid of all of the war housing projects that it created. And one of those, in most parts of the country, local housing agencies took them over and turned them into their local public housing projects. Here, Berkeley and Albany refused to take it over. They said it wasn't an area that was suitable for housing. And so Colderness's Village was demolished. The whites who were living there were able to find housing in Berkeley and Albany and Oakland. The African Americans were unable to find housing. And so the city of Berkeley hired a social worker to place them in public housing in Oakland and elsewhere. They demolished those projects, the cities demolished those projects, and not too long afterwards, Berkeley, on the same land that it said was unsuitable for housing, built what's now known as University Village for graduate students and their families. So that's how the public housing programs of the federal government created a pattern of segregation that exists to this day.
You know, this really makes me think a lot also about the homeowners that we serve, people that we are serving that are African American, extremely low income. Many of these people were displaced by what was then the Cypress Freeway, which separated, the city down from West Oakland, really a demolishing of what was most of Chinatown. There are no resources now as low income homeowners for them to be able to be safe and healthy in their homes. So what Rebuilding Together has been doing is we've become a safety net. And what we're most concerned about is how to help people to maintain the assets that they have been able to accrue. And so that they're able to be, carried on for next generations of their family. So I guess I'm interested in maybe some of your thoughts about that, but also in the banking and the redlining that really helped to, kind of force people into a very narrow area.
Well, okay, there's a lot there. Let me.
Sorry, I think I'm queen of the compound question. I apologize.
Okay, it's all right. Let me pick on a couple of points there. Redlining, a term we commonly use. The term redlining has its origins again in the New Deal during the Roosevelt administration and the Depression. At the time, the kinds of mortgages that we are familiar with, amortized mortgages with long terms, 20 or 30 years. Each month you make the same payment, but the amount of principal increases, that you amount of equity you have each month because the ratio of principal to interest changes over time. That was unknown during the Depression, at the beginning of the Depression. The kind of mortgages that families had, and most of them were affluent, upper middle class, the kind of mortgages that they had were interest-only mortgages with enormous down payments, 50% perhaps, and then an interest-only mortgage for short-term, 5 to 7 years, that homeowners typically refinanced with a new interest-only mortgage at the end of the term. During the Depression, though, you couldn't refinance. Banks weren't making loans. And so families who owned their homes were losing them because they couldn't get new 5 to 7 year interest-only mortgages. One of the first New Deal agencies was the Homeowners Loan Corporation, whose job it was to refinance the mortgages of families like this who were in danger of default or who have defaulted. And they did so by issuing the first substantial number of amortized mortgages, the kind that we know today, to these families. The other thing that the Homeowners Loan Corporation did, though, was it drew maps of every metropolitan area of the country, and to guide federal agencies into where it would be less risky to make federal loans as the federal mortgage insurance program increased. And neighborhoods where African Americans lived were colored red on these maps. And that's where the term redlining comes from. The areas where that were all white were colored green. Areas that were in danger of becoming African American or having African Americans living there were colored yellow. So the term redlining has its origins in an explicitly racial policy of the federal government. Later, when the Federal Housing Administration and was established to issue mortgages, first-time mortgages to new homeowners, not refinancing like the Homeowners Loan Corporation, those redlining maps were used as guides. They weren't rigid, but they were used as guides about where federal mortgage guarantees would be issued, and federal agencies stayed away from red line neighborhoods. The result is it was very difficult for African Americans to get mortgages in those areas. And if they did get mortgages, they had to pay very high interest rates because the federal government wouldn't insure them. And it depressed their incomes. And it was one of the policies that impoverished African Americans relative to whites in this country. We now typically people use the term redlining to talk about all of the federal housing programs that were discriminatory. For example, the refusal to permit African Americans to move to suburban locations that the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration after World War II created on a whites-only basis. But that's not technically where the term redlining comes from. It comes from the refusal to issue mortgages to African Americans living in urban areas that were colored red. And as a result, in many parts of the country where African Americans couldn't get conventional mortgages at all, not just mortgages at high interest rates without federal insurance, a contract system developed, like buying a house on the installment plan, that speculators would so-called sell. They weren't really selling them any more than a department store would sell a garment to somebody that they put aside and made payments on, and the department store would repossess it if they missed a payment. Same way African-American homeowners who couldn't get federally insured mortgages, FHA mortgages, the way whites could in these red line neighborhoods, had to buy homes from these speculators on a contract system. If they missed a single payment or even were late on a single payment, the speculators could repossess the homes and the families had no equity in them.
So it was difficult. I think that what, if I'm understanding what you found at all of this history tells us it was very difficult for people to, quite an achievement for them to have been able to achieve having the equity in their homes, to own their homes, and to have that as an asset. Do you have a sense of what, I actually don't know what percentage of the population has been impacted in that way. I don't know if you have a sense of what that is.
Well, the African American home ownership rate is much, much lower than the white home ownership rate because of the policies that in part because of the policies that I've described. I don't recall the exact figure. I think that the white home ownership rate is somewhere in the 60% range, and the African American home ownership rate is maybe 15 points lower than that. It was higher before all the foreclosures took place during the collapse of the housing market after 2008. It was never as high as the white home ownership rate, but it's at a low point now and hasn't really recovered from that collapse.
And and of course the essence of that too is that that's part of the cycle of poverty and the impact of the housing segregation that was really engineered. I wonder now, you've talked a little bit about the changes, potential changes in zoning. I wonder if someone's actually asking an interesting question now, if in your research, if you found why the lawmakers really made this turn to really try to stop the home ownership and the equity or the wealth development for African Americans.
I'm sorry, Lisa, were you talking about zoning now, or?
Oh, I'm sorry. I actually apologize. I made a little bit of a pivot there. I saw someone had a very riveting question, which is about, in your research, if there was a reason behind sort of this very strong pivot that the government made to really codify this kind of segregation.
Well, you know, we haven't really talked, except I just alluded to it briefly, we haven't really talked about the biggest program that the federal government followed to segregate the country. And that was well, first it was, there was privately developed war housing with federal funds during World War II. A good example of that is San Lorenzo in the East Bay, for whites only, explicitly for whites only. I think it was the Navy Department that subsidized the construction of San Lorenzo, and there were developments all over the Bay Area like that. But the biggest impact of the federal government on segregation of this country was an explicit design of the federal government, Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration after World War II, to suburbanize the entire white working class and lower middle class population. I mentioned earlier that blacks and whites were both living in urban areas prior to that time, because they needed to be located, they needed to live close enough to be able to get to their jobs in downtown factory districts. But that no longer became necessary when the highways began being built and workers could live farther away from the center city, either if they had cars or because their jobs were also moving out in that direction, rural areas. So the federal government began a program that was explicitly racial, that was designed to move the entire white working class, lower middle class population, returning war veterans in particular, out of urban areas into single family homes in all white suburbs. It was an explicitly racial program. One example, there are many, many in the Bay Area. Westlake is one of them, and Daly City. The biggest one on the East Coast was Levittown, east of New York City. Places like Lakewood, outside Los Angeles, would be another example of one of these giant suburbs. These developers could never, ever have developed the capital to build these giant suburbs on their own. Westlake in Daly City was 15,000 homes. Levittown, east of New York City, 17,000 homes. Where in the world were developers like William Levitt or in Westlake, Henry Dolger the developer there, where are they going to get the capital to buy the land and build 15, 17,000 homes in one place? We were in the suburban country at that time, remember. Everybody thought this was a crazy idea. Who's going to move out to these suburbs? Nobody's going to buy these homes. These guys are crazy. No bank would lend them the money. The only way they could get the money to build these suburbs was to go to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, submit their plans to the development, including, the architectural design, the materials they were going to use, the layout of the streets, every detail, and an explicit commitment never to sell a home to an African American. This was not the action of rogue bureaucrats. And by the way, it's not just an explicit commitment, but in places like Westlake and Daly City and Levittown and many, many others, the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration required them to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans and rental to African Americans. And those deeds still exist in the East Bay as well as around the entire Bay Area on deeds today. I started to say before that this was not the action of rogue bureaucrats working at the FHA and VA. It was written federal policy. The FHA distributed an underwriting manual to appraisers all over the country whose job it was to recommend for federal bank guarantees applications of developers who wanted to build suburban developments or projects of any size. And the manual said that you could not recommend for a federal bank guarantee a loan to a developer who was going to develop an integrated project. The manual went so far as to say that you couldn't even make recommend for a loan guarantee a developer of an all-white project if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living. Because in the words of the federal policy manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said. Infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. In my book, The Color of Law, this is not an East Bay example, but I have a photograph of a 6-foot-high, half-mile-long concrete wall that the developer in Michigan had to put up to separate his proposed development from a nearby African-American neighborhood as a condition of getting a federal bank guarantee for his loan to build the development. This was such an explicit policy. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. As I say, there's no basis in reality to it whatsoever. And that's how the white noose that George Romney was talking about was created in every metropolitan area of the country.
How, one of the things that I think was one of the main points of your book was the difference between de facto and de jure discrimination. And so I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about that for people that might not be familiar with the premise.
Well, that's what we've been talking about. As I said, de facto segregation is the idea that this all just happened by accident, it happened naturally, happened because of private businesses or people wanting to live with each other of the same race. That's a very common term. We all use it. De jure is a term that's not so common. It's the opposite. It's segregation that's unconstitutional, that was created by law, jure, J-U-R-E. So they're two opposites. The key point, because I'm not suggesting we should start using the term de jure as a commonplace word. I think unconstitutional is a better way of saying the same thing. But de facto segregation is the myth that we all have that it came by accident.
De jure is a good crossword puzzle word, but maybe not in common parlance.
Right.
So, I do wonder if the federal policies that you were talking about, have they been repealed, as in taken off the books, or is it that they're not, they're just not enforced actively?
Well, these were not laws, so they didn't take off the books. These were policies that were implemented, regulatory policies, so they didn't have to be taken off the books. The federal government continued to segregate explicitly all its housing programs until 1962, when President Kennedy issued an executive order telling them to stop. the executive order would have been entirely unnecessary if the federal government wasn't creating segregation at the time. So 1962 is when federal agencies were prohibited from doing it explicitly. But federal agencies continued, for example, to subsidize builders who themselves would not sell to African Americans. It continued to subsidize projects handled by real estate agents who would not show homes to African Americans. So the policies continued sometime after that. In 1968, as you know, we passed the Fair Housing Act, which prohibited not just the government, but private individuals from discriminating in the sale or rental of housing. But we didn't really put effective enforcement mechanisms into the Fair Housing Act for another 20 years until 1988. It's pretty recent. The Fair Housing Act is pretty weakly enforced. So we still have a good deal of discrimination in the sale and rental of housing, even though there's no longer an official requirement that we segregate.
I think one of the policies or regulations that are put in, and I don't actually know if it's a federal, if it was federal, but are the CRA requirements for banks about community reinvestment. And yet that hasn't, it hadn't stopped foreclosures. It's not, on the one hand, it seems like it's a significant amount of money, but into the systems for, into low-income communities related to housing. But it's definitely not been enough, certainly to make a meaningful, significant change. So I do wonder what you think about what type of policies, regulatory or otherwise, do you think we need that might help us advance this issue of, reconnecting communities and keeping people in their homes?
Well, there are many, many policies that we should follow. And in fact, we know what they are. They're widely known. Housing policy experts talk about them all the time. What's missing is not policy ideas, but a new civil rights movement that's going to be as aggressive as the civil rights movement of the 1960s in insisting that these patterns need to be reformed. I can give you examples of policies that are constitutionally required, even though the court at this point doesn't recognize it. I mentioned, for example, these giant suburbs that were financed on an all-white basis by the federal government. Many of them are still all white. Levittown, the example I used a few minutes ago, east of New York City, 17,000 homes. As a result of the Fair Housing Act, 2% of Levittown is now African American. The homes now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. That's not affordable to working class families of either race unless they have bequests of wealth from their parents or grandparents that enables them to make down payments for those homes. And the only people who have that are typically whites, because when African Americans were excluded from these post-war developments that appreciated in value, they didn't gain the wealth from the equity in homes that whites did. So we have these suburbs. Levittown, as I say, is now 2% African American, but it's in a neighborhood that's about 17% African American. So what do you do about that 13% that the Fair Housing Act is incapable of addressing? Well, it seems to me that you need an affirmative action program in housing to remedy the constitutional violation of how that community was created. Federal government should be buying up homes in Levittown, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, whatever they cost, whatever the market rate is, and resell them to qualified African Americans, to working class and middle class African Americans, who otherwise would not be able to afford today to live in communities that were easily affordable to African Americans at the time that they were built when they were excluded. So that's one policy. Zoning reform is another one. We ought to be abolishing single-family zoning, and I know there have been efforts in California, and particularly here in the Bay Area, to do that. It's unsuccessful. There hasn't been enough political support to do it. There have been two efforts by, I guess, State Senator Scott Weiner to abolish single-family zoning and near transit stops. Unsuccessful. So we need a new civil rights movement that's going to make it uncomfortable to maintain these present patterns.
And I think you've mentioned that a few times about a new civil rights movement. And so I do wonder what type of actions do you think that community leaders and community members should be taking to really help push that needle forward?
Well, there are many, many of them. I can give this to you in the chat, and you can distribute it to your attendees. About 6 weeks ago, I published an article in the New York Times in which I focused on San Mateo as an example. San Mateo I focus on one community in San Mateo called Hillsdale, an all-white community of San Mateo, which was created on an explicitly racial basis in the 1940s for working class families. The homes sold there for, at the time, for about $5,000 in the mid-1940s. In today's money, as I say, it's roughly $100,000. Today in Hillsdale, those homes sell for $1.5 million. $1.5 million. So anybody who was a white family who bought that home and kept it in subsequent generations gained over $1 million, well over $1 million in wealth that they hadn't earned as a result of the appreciation and value of the home. Well, in this article, I described the builder, the developer of this community, the bank that financed the builder and the mortgages in that community when it was first built, and the real estate agent who handled the sales to whites only in that community. And each of these still exists today. There are successors, but maybe not the same company, but the successors bought the company, the original company. The bank that was originally responsible for financing this all-white development has been absorbed by one of the major banks, by Wells Fargo. The developer that built the community, the Bohannon Company, is still in existence here in the Bay Area today. The real estate agent that handled the segregated sales in that community has since been absorbed by Coldwell Banker. So you've got these three big institutions in the Bay Area that created that segregation. Well, do they have a responsibility to do something to fix it? I'm not minimizing the role of government. As I say, my whole theory and my whole argument is that this is an unconstitutional system because government created it. But that doesn't mean that there weren't private institutions that cooperated with the government in doing it and went along willingly, didn't object to this racial policy. Well, those three, a local civil rights group in San Mateo, for example, and I'm just giving this as an example, should be creating a pressure campaign on those three institutions to create a reparations fund, a local reparations fund that would subsidize the movement of African Americans into white areas of that community, that would press for the abolition of the zoning ordinances in that community that prohibit the construction of townhouses or garden apartments or any place else that a working middle-class family can afford. So those are the kinds of activities that local civil rights groups can engage in an all-white community like that. And in other communities, there are different tactics and different kinds of activities in which they should engage.
Do you think it would be a fair action to really put the pressure on the housing developers that actually were part, like a Bohannon, just by way of example, since you mentioned them, for them to be part of a reparation fund or providing or building other kinds of housing for more integrated housing?
Yes, absolutely. Bohannon, by the way, also built San Lorenzo.
And someone was just noting that San Mateo has a ballot measure Y on the ballot today that is actually entrenching the patterns of separation, not the patterns of coming back together. So I am wondering, in terms of people's actions, I think that that's what everyone's really hungry for. I think people really wanting to know what to do. So I hear you talking about pressure groups, which I think makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of, I think a lot of people want to be community advocates. But is there, is there a specific approach that you think would work or be effective, either from a advocacy perspective or from a legal perspective, that might be informed by the information you've gathered in your book?
No, I think it varies from community to community, because while these patterns were national, they were expressed in detail in different ways. I think that, for example, in the example I gave a few minutes ago, I think there's almost every community, you can identify at least some of the creators of the segregation of that community in the 20th century, and find the successors of those creators as a way to put pressure on them. But the tactics will vary from place to place. In some places, gentrification is a big challenge, and action needs to be taken to prevent massive displacement of African Americans from communities that they've long called home in the process of gentrification. In some places, it may be too late for that. I don't want to mention any names, but gentrification has gone on too rapidly to be able to prevent that massive displacement. In the Bay Area, as you know, we've got Oakland in particular is no longer the mostly Black segregated community as it was. It's flipping now, becoming more and more affluent. And many former residents are being displaced to places like Antioch, even Modesto, because they can't no longer afford to live in the communities that they used to call home. So the tactics to resist that are very different from the tactics in a place like Hillsdale and San Mateo. So I don't have a formula. What we need are local groups, and I want to emphasize that those groups have to be biracial, multi-ethnic. This is not something that can be led by whites. But whites need to participate in a meaningful way. But it needs to be an active civil rights group, much like we had in the 1960s and 1950s, to address other forms of segregation. We spent a lot of time recently talking about John Lewis and his call for making good trouble. Well, that's what's needed today on this issue, which we didn't address in the 1960s.
Another thing that I'm interested in knowing is if you were surprised by the ravenous interest in your book. I mean, you're being interviewed everywhere. So many people, public thinkers of our time, are so interested in hearing what you have to say.
Well, it's not just my book. It's we're having, as I said, a more accurate and passionate discussion about race than at any time previously in American history about the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow. It's unprecedented. You look at the bestseller lists. My book is on it. That's surprising, but it's virtually every book on it on the nonfiction bestseller list is about race. So we're having this conversation. It's unique. It's unprecedented. Out of it, I'm hopeful that a new civil rights movement can grow. It's astounding how rapidly this happened. And so, yes, I'm surprised. I had great difficulty getting this book published. I went to literary agent after literary agent, all of whom told me that we were in a post-racial society and nobody's interested in this kind of stuff anymore. And my publisher eventually agreed to publish the book and ran 5,000 copies. That's what his expectation of the sales were. So, the book was, it's not just my book though. The context for this is Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy, the work of Ta-Nehisi Coates, whom you mentioned before. We're having a national conversation that's unprecedented, and I'm hopeful that out of it will emerge an activist movement.
It is such a pleasure. It was wonderful of you to agree to speak with us. And we're lucky just to say that Richard's daughter, Leah Rothstein, was a member of the Rebuilding Together board for many years. And so that's how we were able to be acquainted with you so intimately. And I wanted to, you are, I'm not sure if you know or not, you are our Aspire awardee for this year. We do this every year. And so I'm not, you can't even, it's an invisible award that you can get through Zoom, but we'll be sending you something more significant. But it's really to thank you so much for supporting, us today and for being a rebuilder. I know you've been out on some projects with us.
Yeah, I want to apologize to you. My daughter had me out painting one site, homes on one site, and you probably had to redo what I did. So I apologize for it, but I tried. And,
I'm sure it was spectacular.
It was a great experience, and I look forward when this pandemic ends to do it again.
Well, thank you again. Thank you so much. I know your schedule is busy. Just sending you a virtual hug, and thank you.
Thank you very much.
I think that I may be introducing the wonderful Lynette Mcelhaney. She is the current city council person for Oakland District 3. We are very, very excited to have her here with us. She is a passionate rebuilder. She is the only person that I have ever met that was able at our last year's event to do a call and repeat while she was on video. We've done a lot of work in again, all throughout Oakland. But Lynette, thank you so much for being here with us today. And we just adore you. And thank you.
No, it's really awesome to be with you all today. And in listening to all of the findings in the color of law, I think it just reminds us of the importance of this moment for us all to show up in this national conversation in ways that allows us to beat back those minority voices that both profit and gain strength from bigotry. What I really enjoyed about reading The Color of Law and listening to Richard today is this truth that it's never been really the majority voice, right? It's been manipulated by powerful interests that are the minority voices. I didn't miss that we were in integrated communities prior to people figuring out how to profiteer on fear. And that is the space in which we live today. But I am so excited that bigotry is on its last gasp for reals, y'all. Our young people give me hope every day because they are not with these structures or these boundaries, and they are without borders because they're able to get on social media and to lift up incredible voices. But that brings us to the important work of RTO. Lisa, you spoke about it, about the clients that you all are serving, folks who endured great prejudice and bias and still found a way to make Oakland home, to make these communities home, and then to turn the throwaway spaces into beautiful places that new folks are arriving in to derive great value. Now we're with the extension of the civil rights movement that both is attacking injustice in policing as well as in our financial markets, which persists. And there is an opportunity for great accountability because of movements like the Reparations Act here that we just adopted from Dr. Shirley Rebert's effort. I'll mess up the AB number without looking at it, but you all will know, I think it's 2142, and HR 40 at the congressional level. And in Oakland, we have just been looking at what are we going to do reparations work. And we do need to do reparations work if we're going to be our whole selves. RTO donors and board members know the process of doing reparation. You really do reparation on physical homes and communities. You bring together integrated teams that show love to some of the most marginalized and sometimes forgotten members of our society. These seniors and disabled folks who contribute to our society through their love, through their families, through their mentorship, some with really long work histories in the public sector and the private sector, and just showing up every day as a woman, as a person of color, as people who have bested these structures and constrictions and systems to still be alive and full of hope. And then to have you all show up in great care is nothing short of miraculous and phenomenal. And that's why I'm what did you call me, Lisa?
You are a rebuilder.
I am a rebuilder. I'm a rebuilder. And you all are in this movement that Reverend Barber talks about, the repairers of the breach. So I know that I'm preaching to the choir right now when I say give generously of your time and your treasure. But I hope that the words I'm giving you right now inspire you to move just beyond yourself and your own personal donation to get others to join this movement. The civil rights movement was never one thing or one group. It was many groups working on many fronts, all with the same purpose. And that was to prove the theory that we can be out of many nations one. That a pluribus unum, that thing that said we can get rid of the feudal societies, we can leave European hierarchies behind. Now we know this is a quest, that our union is never perfect at any given moment. But what I love about this notion of a more perfect union means that we are in the process of perfecting. We can examine past practices for how it's failed us. We can choose to let go of those practices and take action affirmatively and intentionally to live into our highest angels. Thank you, RTO, for being in the civil rights flow. That may not be the language that you use, but that is certainly who you are and what you do. You are a legacy keeper of the great promise. And thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you for being all of that and leaning into this very present moment with this very courageous conversation today, because it was in law that we codified hate. It will be in law and in our individual actions that we dismantle hate and replace it with love. So thank you all for allowing me to once again be a part of this magical moment. Even virtually, you give me chills and you bring me to tears. And I'm super excited to have listened in on this conversation today. I love you with my whole heart full.
Thank you, Lynette. You always have something so beautiful and meaningful to say. I want to thank everyone for being here today, for helping us to keep Oakland covered, for your time. And I hope that you all stay safe and be healthy and take good care, and that we all stay in touch. So thank you again.